So today we're going to be talking about finding angles using SOH CAH TOA. So a reminder, these are for our right triangles. What's going to happen is we're going to have two of the side lengths and we're going to be asked to find a certain angle. Now reminder, we use SOH CAH TOA to help us remember our three trig ratios. So we have sine of x equals opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine of x equals adjacent over hypotenuse. And tangent of x equals opposite over adjacent. So remember, each of these letters stands for some part of our trig functions. So for example, sine, opposite, hypotenuse, SOH. Cosine, adjacent, hypotenuse. Tangent, opposite, adjacent. Now the big piece here is that we have these x's right here. And just a reminder that those are the angle. So before, what we were doing was we were trying to get the x by itself, but that was on the right side of the equation where in the fraction. Now we're going to be trying to get the angle value. So it's going to be a little different. Now what I want you to start to do is look at your calculator. What's going to happen is we're going to use what we call the inverse of either sine, cosine, or tangent. Now what that is that's kind of the opposite of that trig function. So it's going to undo itself from that angle. So in this case, our angle is going to be an x or a variable, and we need to undo that to get that value. So what will happen is you will get something that looks like this. Sine x equals 3 over 5, and you'll have a triangle. That means you'll have an opposite and hypotenuse, and you're going to plug that in. Now to get the x by itself, we use the inverse sine. And what that means is this notation here. So we have an exponent of -1, so that represents the inverse. And we're going to take that of our fraction, of our ratio that we have. So two different ways that you can plug this into the calculator. Most of you, if you are using your iPad calculator, are going to do something like the second version here, where you're going to do the fraction first. You're going to do 3 divided by 5. So remember, each of these are like buttons on the calculator. Equals, and that'll give you a decimal. And then you'll hit the second button. It's probably in the upper left-hand corner-ish of your calculator. And then sine. That should give you about 36.9, and that's a rounded answer. Now on some calculators, like the one I use, I have to hit the second button first, then sine, then 3 divided by 5 equals, and that will give me the same answer. All right, so what I want you to do first is try your calculator, see which order you need to do things in. You should get 36.9 as your answer, and remember, you want to be in degree mode. All right, so those are the things you want to check first. So now we're going to look at some examples here. So I'm going to look from the angle that has the question mark on it. And from that angle, I have my opposite, because that's directly across, and I have my hypotenuse, because that's across from my right angle. Remember, the hypotenuse is always across from the 90-degree angle. So this tells me I have sine, because I have opposite and hypotenuse. So I'm going to plug this in as sine of x, because we don't know that angle, that's what we're solving for, equals opposite, which is 5, over hypotenuse, which is 12. All right, so in my calculator, I'm going to solve to get that x by itself, so I'm going to do the inverse sine of 5 divided by 12. So I'm going to do 5 divided by 12 equals, and I'm going to get 0.416 repeating, and then hit second sine, and that'll give me about 24.6, and that's a rounded answer. All right, so now I'm going to try another one. And in this case, we have opposite, because it's directly across, and we have the adjacent. Remember, it's attached, but it's not the hypotenuse. So that tells me we're going to be talking about tangent. So I have tangent of x, which is my angle, equals 19 over 41, opposite over adjacent. All right, I'm going to do the same thing. To undo that x from my tangent, I do the inverse tangent of 19 divided by 41. All right, and so plug that into your calculator. And again, those of you using your iPads or your iPhones, you do 19 divided by 41 equals, and then make sure the second button is pressed, and then you're going to hit tangent, and that'll give you about 24.9. All right, and now last example here, I'm going to look at the same thing. So from this angle that we're trying to solve for, we have the adjacent, so that's the attached side here. And we also have the hypotenuse, which is directly across from that right angle. So adjacent and hypotenuse, that'll tell me I'm talking about cosine. So I have cosine of x, because remember that's our angle, we don't know what it is, equals adjacent, which is 19, over hypotenuse, which is 21. So to get the x by itself, I'm going to take the inverse cosine of 19 over 21. All right, and I'm going to plug that into my calculator, and I will get about 25.2. Now I do want you to keep in mind, sometimes you'll be asked to round to the nearest whole degree. So if that's the case, you're just going to either round up or down so that you have an angle with no decimal. So right here, 24.6, since that 6 is bigger than 4, I'm going to round up to 25 if I was asked to the whole degree. This 24.9 would round up to 25 as well. And this 25.2 would stay the same at 25. So it'd all be 25-degree angles. All right, and we're just going to practice a few more. So again, the important piece is understanding what function do I have. From this angle, I'm looking at the opposite and the adjacent. So that tells me I'm talking about tangent. So I have tangent x equals 8 over 34, my opposite over adjacent. To undo the tangent from the x, I'm going to take the inverse tangent of 8 over 34. All right, and I'm going to plug that into the calculator. And that will give me about 13.2. Now again, if I wanted to round that to the nearest whole degree, I would round that down to 13. All right, let's look at the next problem. So from this angle, I have opposite, and I have the hypotenuse. Again, this is opposite because it's directly across from that angle, and the hypotenuse is always directly across from the right angle. So opposite and hypotenuse tells me I'm talking about sine. So I have sine of x, and you can pick any letter here to be your variable for your angle, equals 2 over 5. So to undo the sine from the x, I'm going to take the inverse. And now again, the inverse is just undoing. The kind of way you're going to think about it is like the multiplication between the sine and the x together. It's ungluing them from each other. Right, so that's what the inverse is. So now we're going to plug this into the calculator, and we're going to get about 23.6. So if we wanted to round this to the nearest whole degree, we'd get a degree measure of 24. All right, now, again, I'm okay with the nearest tenth in your answer, but sometimes I just want you to be aware. Sometimes you will be asked to round to the nearest whole degree. All right, and then lastly, we have this angle here. And from there we have the hypotenuse. We also have the adjacent. So adjacent and hypotenuse tells me I'm talking about cosine. So I have cosine x equals adjacent, which is 25, over hypotenuse, which is 26. So I'm going to do the inverse cosine of 25 over 26. And that will give me about 15.9. And rounded to the nearest whole degree, that would be 16 degrees. So as you're doing this, just remember SOH CAH TOA. It's the same setup we've used for solving for sides, except now our x is next to that trig function. To undo that trig function, you're going to use the inverse of that function. Whenever you're solving for an angle, you will always, always, always use the inverse. So please keep that in mind. We're going to be practicing this for a couple of days and just trying to really remember SOH CAH TOA, figuring out if you have adjacent, opposite, or hypotenuse sides, and plugging them into the functions and solving.